Tomasz Waga never imagined that his quiet life in East London would end at the hands of the Albanian Mafia. Follow the chilling story of betrayal, surveillance, and a brutal murder that shook the city to its core. Please subscribe for daily new update of gang crime story and watch till end. Tomasz Waga had always lived a quiet life in East London. He arrived in the city from Poland years ago, hoping to build a stable future. By day, he worked at a small import-export company, handling paperwork and shipping schedules. On the surface, his life seemed ordinary. Neighbors saw him as polite and reserved, often smiling politely in passing but never revealing too much about himself. He frequented the same cafes, walked the same streets, and lived in the same modest apartment building where he had grown comfortable over the years. Yet, beneath this calm routine, danger was slowly creeping closer, a danger Tomasz could not yet sense. Unknown to him, the Albanian Mafia had taken an interest in him months ago. Rumors and whispers in the criminal underworld suggested that Tomasz had accidentally come into possession of information that could expose certain Mafia operations. Details of shipments, contacts, and small financial transactions that seemed harmless to him were exactly what the Mafia wanted to keep hidden. Their reach was long, their methods ruthless, and their patience non-existent. For them, no loose end could remain unchecked. The first signs of trouble appeared subtly. A black van was occasionally spotted near his workplace, always parked a short distance away, engines off, windows tinted. Tomasz tried to dismiss it as coincidence. He convinced himself the van belonged to a delivery service or a security company. But soon, the encounters became more deliberate. A man in a dark hoodie would appear on the same street as Tomasz, watching him from a distance before disappearing without a trace. Small details in daily life, such as a shadow moving past a window at night or the distant sound of a car engine slowing down when he walked outside, started to unsettle him. Despite the growing unease, Tomasz tried to maintain his normal routine. He went to work, ran errands, and met friends at a local cafe. He even considered reporting his concerns to the police. But something held him back. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps he felt that drawing attention would worsen the situation. Tomasz's life had always been about quiet resilience and careful decisions, and he believed that keeping his head down might protect him. But the Mafia's surveillance was relentless. Every step Tomasz took seemed anticipated, every movement noted. It was as if an invisible hand followed him through the streets, ensuring he was never truly alone. Even mundane activities, such as buying groceries or walking his dog, carried an underlying tension. He began noticing the same strangers again and again, always at the edges of his vision, disappearing whenever he tried to confront them directly. One rainy evening, Tomasz left work later than usual. Streetlights reflected on wet asphalt, and the city was quieter than normal. As he walked past a row of shuttered shops, the black van appeared again, sliding silently into the lane behind him. The door opened, and masked figures glanced in his direction. Tomasz froze, his heart pounding. He realized, with a sinking sense of dread, that his life had already changed. What had seemed like coincidence was, in fact, the first act of a dangerous game. The Albanian Mafia had found him, and there would be no turning back. A week after the unsettling encounter with the black van, Tomasz Waga began noticing small changes in his life that made him uneasy. At first they seemed insignificant. An unfamiliar car parked near his apartment, a stranger lingering near the corner store he frequented, or a shadow passing by his window late at night. But the unease grew when he found the envelope. It had no return address, and the paper was plain, almost deliberately unremarkable. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing Tomasz at his workplace, walking through the streets, even entering his apartment building. Each image captured him unaware, and each image carried a quiet menace. He understood immediately, someone had been following him, someone dangerous. Fear took root in Tomasz's mind, gripping him with a weight he could not easily shake. His first instinct was to show the envelope to the police, but he hesitated. The stories he had heard about the Albanian Mafia haunted him. Their ruthlessness, their capacity for violence, and their ability to strike without warning. Reporting them might have made him more of a target, not less. He decided instead to take matters quietly into his own hands, hoping to remain invisible and avoid attracting further attention. But the Mafia's reach was longer than he could imagine. Tomasz began to notice patterns he had previously ignored. The man in the hoodie appeared more frequently, sometimes standing across the street for hours, never moving, always watching. Vehicles would slow down near him, stop at intersections slightly longer than normal, only to vanish moments later. Every sound, every movement carried a subtle threat. The quiet life he had built was crumbling, replaced by a world of constant observation and fear. He could not walk anywhere without wondering if eyes followed him from a distance. Sleep became shallow, interrupted by dreams of dark alleys and unmarked vans. Even the familiar streets of London felt menacing, transformed into corridors of uncertainty. Tomasz's fear deepened when he realized that his routines had become predictable. The Mafia seemed to know exactly where he would be and when. His trips to the market, his evening walks, even his occasional stops at a cafe, were no longer private. The photos in the envelope were proof of their surveillance, but he could sense that this was only the beginning. The messages they sent were not words. They were threats written in observation and presence, a silent warning that his movements were no longer his own. He tried to be cautious, altering his routes and avoiding familiar paths. Yet each change seemed anticipated. The Mafia's patience was terrifying. They did not rush. They waited for the perfect moment to strike. Every glance over his shoulder, every unfamiliar car, every lingering figure served as a reminder that he was being hunted. Tomasz realized that no amount of caution could fully protect him. He had been drawn into a world where survival depended not just on vigilance, but on understanding an enemy who never slept, never forgot, and never forgave. The envelope, the photographs, and the shadows outside his apartment were more than warnings. They were the beginning of a slow, relentless siege. Tomasz Waga, once an ordinary man with ordinary concerns, had stepped into a game controlled by the Albanian Mafia. A dangerous truth had been uncovered, and the stakes were life and death. The sense of impending doom was inescapable, and for Tomasz the quiet streets of London had become a maze of fear from which there might be no escape. Tomasz Waga had always been careful about who he trusted, but he had one person he considered a reliable partner in his small import-export business: Viktor Radovich. Viktor was charismatic, efficient, and always seemed to have the answers Tomasz needed. Over time, he became more than a colleague, almost like a friend. Tomasz confided in him about work challenges, minor setbacks, and the small worries that came with living in a foreign city. He never suspected that Viktor harbored a secret loyalty, one that could prove fatal. Unbeknownst to Tomasz, Viktor had been in contact with the Albanian Mafia for months. Their reach extended into legitimate businesses, allowing them to monitor potential threats quietly and methodically. Viktor had been feeding them information about Tomasz's daily routines, his habits, and even the small details of his apartment. Each day, Viktor painted a clearer picture of Tomasz's life, unknowingly, or perhaps willingly, guiding the Mafia closer to their target. Every late-night delivery, every office visit, and every trip out of the city was meticulously logged, creating a map of Tomasz's existence. The first signs of betrayal were subtle. Tomasz noticed small inconsistencies in Viktor's behavior, things he had previously dismissed. Viktor would sometimes hesitate when Tomasz asked about minor business issues, offering vague answers. Occasionally he would arrive late to meetings or seem distracted, staring off as though listening to someone else. Tomasz attributed it to stress or fatigue, never imagining the truth behind it. He trusted Viktor, and in that trust lay his vulnerability. One afternoon, Tomasz walked through the crowded streets of London and noticed a familiar figure standing across the road. The man in the dark hoodie had been following him for weeks, yet this time, Viktor was nearby, casually strolling behind him as though unaware of the man. Tomasz felt a sudden chill. The realization slowly crept in. Someone he considered a friend might be responsible for the constant surveillance. The thought was terrifying, almost impossible to accept. Betrayal by a trusted partner was far more dangerous than the threat from strangers, because it meant the enemy had intimate knowledge of his life. As days passed, the Mafia's moves became bolder, more deliberate. They knew when Tomasz left work, when he visited the cafe, even the routes he preferred while walking home. Victor, seemingly unknowingly, had provided all the tools they needed to corner him. Every change Tomasz made in his routines was anticipated, every cautious step foiled before it began. It was no longer a game of chance, it was a calculated plan, and Victor had become the instrument of it. Tomasz realized the full extent of his predicament only when he saw the black van again, this time parked directly across the street from Victor's apartment. The pieces fell into place, the photographs, the shadowing figures, the strange hesitations in Victor's behavior. He was not only being hunted by an organized and ruthless criminal network, but the person he trusted most had been guiding them. The weight of this betrayal was suffocating, and Tomasz knew that any misstep now could be fatal. The Albanian Mafia was patient, methodical, and ruthless, and with Victor's inside help, they had all the leverage they needed. From that moment on, Tomasz understood that his fate was slipping beyond his control. He was trapped in a web spun by those who knew him best, and the shadows lurking in London streets were closing in with silent inevitability. The betrayal was complete, and the danger more immediate than ever. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening, the kind of night where the city's streets glistened with reflections of streetlights on wet asphalt. Tomasz Waga had stayed late at the office, trying to focus on work to push fear from his mind. The persistent shadows, the black vans, and the eerie feeling of being watched had become unbearable. Yet he convinced himself that if he stayed calm and cautious, he might escape unnoticed. He did not. The Albanian Mafia had been waiting, watching and planning every step with relentless precision. As Tomasz walked through the narrow, slick streets, he noticed a car idling ahead. Its dark windows reflected the orange glow of the street lamps, and the engine's hum seemed to echo unnaturally in the quiet night. He felt the familiar pang of unease but dismissed it as coincidence. Then he saw the black van slide silently into the lane behind him, almost as if it had been lying in wait. Panic gripped him for the first time in weeks. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, that his careful routines had failed. The masked figures waiting inside the van moved with cold efficiency. Before Tomasz could react, strong hands grabbed him from behind, dragging him toward the vehicle. The rain drenched him, but the cold and fear he felt were far stronger than the chill of the night. He struggled, but the men were well trained, their grip ironclad. The city around him seemed to vanish, reduced to the sound of footsteps, the hiss of rain, and the low rumble of the van's engine as it sped away. There were no witnesses, or if there had been, fear had silenced them before they could act. The van carried him far from the familiar streets of East London, twisting through industrial areas and empty warehouses. Tomasz tried to memorize landmarks, searching desperately for a chance to escape, but the Mafia's plan was meticulous. They knew the city as well as he did, and every turn led deeper into isolation. Eventually they arrived at a desolate warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place abandoned by legitimate businesses and steeped in sinister reputation. Inside, the dim light and the smell of damp concrete created a suffocating sense of dread. Tomasz realized, with cold certainty, that his life had reached a point from which there was no immediate return. Inside the warehouse, the Albanian Mafia confronted him. The air was thick with tension, a mix of fear, anticipation, and a silent promise of violence. They demanded information about shipments and contacts Tomasz knew nothing about, testing his knowledge, his patience, and his courage. Every refusal he gave seemed to deepen their resolve. The men moved with a quiet menace, their presence alone enough to break the strongest spirit. Hours passed with threats unspoken but understood, and Tomasz felt the first true weight of despair pressing down on him. In that warehouse, Tomasz Waga became more than a man in danger. He was a pawn in a calculated game of intimidation and control. The Albanian Mafia had removed him from the safety of his routines, from the familiar streets that once offered comfort, and placed him directly into their domain, where every action and reaction was under their control. At that moment, escape seemed impossible, and survival uncertain. The shadows that had haunted him on London streets were no longer abstract. They were real, close, and merciless. The warehouse was cold, damp, and suffocating, a perfect stage for the Albanian Mafia's cruelty. Tomasz Waga had no idea how long he had been held there. Hours blurred into darkness, punctuated only by the sound of footsteps and the occasional low murmur of his captors. Each moment stretched endlessly, and the weight of fear pressed heavily on him. He understood that this was no ordinary confrontation. The men around him were professionals, their ruthlessness honed over years of illicit activity. They were not seeking negotiation, they sought obedience, fear, and absolute control. The initial interrogation escalated quickly. Tomasz was questioned about shipments, contacts, and alliances, none of which he could provide. Each refusal, each attempt to explain his ignorance, seemed to provoke a darker reaction. The Mafia's methods were designed to break him physically and psychologically. Bruises formed, and fatigue gnawed at his mind, but the terror of what might come next was far worse than the pain. Tomasz began to understand the pattern. The violence was not random, it was calculated, a demonstration meant to show that resistance was futile. Days passed, though Tomasz lost track of time. Food and water were given sparingly, enough to keep him alive, but not enough to sustain him comfortably. The Mafia's patience was part of the strategy. They were not in a hurry. They watched him, noting every reaction, every flicker of hope, every sign of fear. In their eyes, Tomasz was already defeated, a man at the mercy of an unstoppable force, and yet, despite the overwhelming terror, he clung to a fragile thread of hope, imagining that somehow, escape might still be possible. Eventually, the Mafia decided Tomasz's fate. His resistance, combined with the information they had sought and could not extract, had sealed his doom. The atmosphere in the warehouse shifted, the quiet menace became active, the tension snapping like a wire. Tomasz realized, with a sinking clarity, that the time he had feared most had arrived. He was dragged to the edge of the warehouse, the dim light catching the hardened faces of men who had long since lost any trace of compassion. The brutality of the Albanian Mafia left no room for mercy. Tomasz Waga's life was extinguished in a calculated act of terror. His body was disposed of far from the city, in a deserted forest, chosen for its isolation and the certainty that no one would stumble upon it by chance. The murder was more than an act of elimination. It was a message, a warning to anyone who might consider crossing the Mafia. They operated in shadows, striking swiftly and decisively, leaving fear in their wake. In the aftermath, investigators found traces of Tomasz's presence in the warehouse and partial evidence of the Mafia's involvement, but the trail was cold. Witnesses were too afraid to come forward, and the organization had vanished, as completely as they had arrived. London had experienced another grim reminder of the power of organized crime, a ruthless system where lives could be destroyed in an instant, and where silence was the only means of survival. The Albanian Mafia's actions left the city shaken, their reach unseen but deeply felt, and Tomasz Waga became another name in a growing list of victims whose stories would haunt those who dared to look too closely. The disappearance of Tomasz Waga sent ripples of fear through the Polish community in East London. People who had once felt safe walking their neighborhoods now looked over their shoulders, wary of strangers and suspicious of even familiar faces. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by whispered conversations and cautious speculation. Some claimed to have seen unmarked cars lurking in quiet streets. Others spoke of men watching from dark corners. Fear became a daily companion, a reminder that the Albanian Mafia's reach extended far beyond the warehouse where Tomasz had met his fate. Police investigations began, but the case quickly proved difficult. The Mafia's operations were meticulously planned and executed, leaving almost no trace. Surveillance cameras had been avoided, witnesses were too terrified to speak, and the few pieces of evidence that were discovered offered more questions than answers. Viktor Radovic, the former business associate who had betrayed Tomasz, became a person of interest, but proving his complicity was another challenge entirely. His careful planning and insider knowledge had left investigators navigating a maze with no clear exit. The system, meant to protect citizens, struggled against an enemy who knew its weaknesses and exploited them without hesitation. As the weeks passed, the community's anxiety grew. Tomasz's story became a cautionary tale, a warning of how even ordinary people could become entangled in the violent and secretive world of organized crime. Shops and businesses tightened security, friends checked on each other more frequently, and conversations often turned to speculation about the Mafia's next move. The Albanian Mafia's presence, though invisible, was palpable. People realized that the organization did not just commit crimes, they commanded fear, shaped behavior, and maintained control through intimidation and violence. Families mourned Tomasz privately, his absence leaving an unfillable void. His apartment remained untouched for weeks, a silent monument to the life that had been stolen. Friends and neighbors remembered him as kind, cautious, and ordinary, someone who had only wanted a simple life far from trouble. Yet that ordinary life had collided with extraordinary danger, and the result was devastating. The Albanian Mafia had proven that their reach was not confined to the shadows. They could strike anywhere, leaving devastation in their wake. Though Tomasz was gone, the implications of his murder lingered. Law enforcement continued to investigate, but the elusive nature of the Mafia meant that many questions remained unanswered. Who else might be involved? How far did their operations extend in London, and what other lives were at risk because of secrets someone had uncovered? The uncertainty kept the city on edge, the fear of the unknown more powerful than any visible threat. Ultimately, Tomasz Waga's death became a story of caution and horror, a stark illustration of the consequences of crossing an organization that operated without mercy. The Albanian Mafia continued its activities quietly, leaving few traces but countless victims in its wake. London had witnessed the consequences of betrayal, the precision of calculated violence, and the enduring fear that comes from knowing that some forces are too powerful to confront openly. Tomasz's story would live on, a chilling reminder that even ordinary lives can be caught in the grip of extraordinary evil, and that silence and caution are often the only defenses against a world that shows no mercy.